So ever since my 30th birthday, I've been worried. I wake up in the morning and I wonder if today is going to bring the change that I've been expecting. I know my family history, and it's about time for a shift in my life. I get up, I go to the mirror, and I look. Is this the morning when my gray hairs really start to show? In all honesty, the addition of gray to the top of my head is not something that worries me, and frankly, it's already happened. Going gray in our 30s actually does run in my family. I remember growing up, my mother was so meticulous about dyeing her hair at the perfect moment so that the roots and the gray never showed. She was really particular about how she looked, making sure every strand matched the original deep black of her natural color, putting on shades of lipstick that made her look both fierce and approachable, wearing neatly ironed pantsuits with the perfect height heels that captured her professionalism and poise. And she did all of that while she was working as a vice president at a consulting firm and practically raising me and my sister on her own. Growing up, my mother was my feminist idol. And then one year, when I was in college, she and my father went on the Hajj, the annual pilgrimage that many Muslims take to the city of Mecca. While on the Hajj, as is custom, she covered her meticulously dyed hair with a white head cover. And the only other time I'd ever seen her do that was when she was praying. In fact, nobody else in her family had covered their head on a regular basis. So then when she arrived back to the US after her trip and told me that she made the decision to start covering her head every day, I was shocked and I was confused. And honestly, I was disappointed. Why would this woman who lived in a society that didn't force her to cover her head make the decision to do so now? Why would my childhood feminist idol choose to observe what seemed to be such an oppressive rule? I felt like she was making a mistake, like she had moved backwards in the fight for the liberation of Muslim women. When I look back at my reflection today, I realize that my mother's decision wasn't the problem. The problem was my thinking about it. Back then, I believed that wearing a headscarf as a Muslim woman, what we in the US commonly call hijab, was a mark of oppression. And it was and still is a common perspective. If a woman is covering her head and her body, she is clearly being forced to do that by a man. She was being told by a male-dominated system that modesty was required of women, and that to disobey that rule is a violation of her faith that could lead to punishment. It is a common narrative that a woman in hijab needs to be liberated. Her body needs to be freed from the tyranny of that patriarchal poly-cotton blend. Well, you and I know it's not that simple. After later conversations with my mother and other hijab-donning activists, I came to a more nuanced understanding. Yes, some women are indeed forced to cover their heads and faces or otherwise face arrest or worse. And some aren't. Some, like my mother, choose to cover their head to make themselves known, to make spaces in societies that say their faith isn't allowed, or that their faith is only practiced by violent extremists. Some women choose to cover their head because it reminds them of their relationship to God, and a God that encourages justice and compassion, and it helps them stay accountable to those values in their interactions with other people. Some women wear hijab so that they can build relationships with people that aren't based on their physical appearance. And some wear hijab for the same reasons that other women don't. They want to control how their body is seen. As Mojakoff's one-sentence poem, Hijab No. 2, so cheekily puts it, "You people have such restrictive dress for women," she said, hobbling away in 3-inch heels and pantyhose to finish out another pink-collared temp pool day. The act of covering by Muslim women can be a sign of both one's oppression and one's self-liberation. But I didn't know that back then. Back then, I thought that you either chose not to cover in order to fight patriarchy, or you played into oppressive systems and wore hijab. There was no possibility of hijab and liberation coexisting in the same person. I had an either-or mindset. No intersection was possible. And unfortunately, an either-or mind is a closed one, and not just when it comes to women in hijab. In an either-or mindset, differences are seen as being in competition with each other. They are framed in ways that make them seem like they are not only in direct conflict, but actually detract value from one another. An either-or mindset creates an artificial separation, telling us that there is no overlap and that there is only one reality that can be viable. It is rooted in and perpetuates a monochromatic way of viewing the world, erasing nuance, erasing experiences, and keeping us from engaging those multiple layers of our identities and lives. As Ibrahim Farajage wrote in his essay, Querying Religious Education, either-or thinking erases millions of people, particularly when it comes to mixed heritage or multiracial people who have to make a choice to identify with only one group, as opposed to being able to define themselves as they choose. An either-or mindset does not operate with a sense of accuracy. It operates with a sense of scarcity. And this sense of scarcity has roots in our dominant culture's individualistic sense of competition. In order to succeed, you must be better than others, and the mark of being better is having more. As Cecilia Miller wrote in The Land of Enough, the world gives us the message that we must look out for our own interests, that life is a race won by the most competitive. The world says that there are limited resources, a finite amount of wealth, goods, and love, and that each of us is on our own as we try to grab them. And we don't have to look too hard at our political headlines to know that this is indeed the message our society is receiving, and the division that it is generating. And with this sense of scarcity and competition comes this arbitrary prioritization of some needs and differences over others, particularly when it comes to identity-based liberation. Because there are seemingly not enough resources or rights to go around, movements for social justice can fall into those traps of partialism and exclusivity for the sake of obtaining guaranteed success for a select few. In our reading by Adrienne Rich, we see a poetic analysis of the ways in which white feminists of the 19th century were indeed oppressed, and they were also privileged. But because of those perceptions of scarcity and competition, to put any resources towards collaborations across race or class to address oppressions rooted in those identities, that had the air of being too risky and unlikely to succeed. And it did result in people advocating for partial freedoms, even within our own Unitarian Universalist tradition. In the struggle for the right to vote, we often lift up the legacies of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony for achieving the right to vote for women. But their efforts, as laudable as they were intentionally partial, because they prioritized the rights of white women over black men. Others, like Lucy Stone, Julia Ward Howe, and Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, they pushed for a joint movement, seeing an overlap in those causes. But the either-or mindset of what was feasible left their efforts unwelcome. And as we know, the right to vote for black people in this country was therefore long delayed, and it continues to be obscured to this day. And broader movements for social transformation are not the only place where we see the exclusivity of an either-or mindset. They can happen in our daily interactions as well. In a recent blog post about his experience of being intentionally excluded, the Reverend Bob Molesbury, a paraplegic UCC minister, wrote that while he was on a tour of a facility to demonstrate its vision for accessibility, the group he was with came to a ramp that was too steep for his wheelchair to travel down. When the rest of the group had come down to the bottom of the ramp, he yelled down, "Excuse me, but I can't get down there." He suggested to the tour guide that maybe they come back to the top of the ramp so he could hear the rest of the tour. And the guide thought about it, and then, Molesbury writes, asked the rest of the group, how many of you would like to continue with the tour, and how many of you would like to go back up to where that guy in the wheelchair is? The tour guide had literally put his participation to a vote. and Molesbury was left behind. He was excluded because the group and the guide had an either-or mindset that could not comprehend how both continuing the tour and including Molesbury could coexist. Their sense of scarcity had limited their vision of what was possible. And unfortunately, we can all too easily see how these sensibilities of scarcity and competition are then twisted by fear to create either-or based hate and institutionalized discrimination. In the struggle for immigration reform, false platforms suggest that immigrants are taking jobs away from hardworking Americans, detracting from our safety, putting uncompensated strain on our healthcare system. Those all tap into this scarcity mindset and have people believing that we must choose between current citizens' well-being or immigrant presence in our country. And in the movement for Black lives, there continues to be resistance to the phrase Black Lives Matter among white people and non-Black people of color, because our sense of scarcity has people believing that to say one race matters is to say that others don't. An either-or mindset with roots in this sense of scarcity and competition takes away any desire to nuance and any impulse to complexify. It takes away our capacity to view experiences and needs outside of our own with compassion. It detracts from our ability to appreciate another person's humanity. So how do we break free from this either-or mindset? How do we move from seeing competition between either realities and towards seeing the collaboration and coexistence of both? To help us answer that question, we have a second poem, one which takes the themes of Adrienne Rich's reflections just a bit further. So I was really excited about using that video, and now that I'm up here, I'm wondering why on earth I thought I could follow that level of prophetic power. But I'm going to try. What those four incredible youth spoke of in their poem is the need and value of intersectionality, particularly as it relates to feminism. A term coined by Black legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, it describes the ways in which certain people experience multiple oppressions simultaneously. In her writing on the experience of Black women in the legal system, Crenshaw emphasizes that the effect of experiencing multiple oppressions as both Black and woman is not a divisible one, but a single synthesized experience that needs to be engaged as a whole. Our observing of such an intersectional approach breaks us out of that either-or mindset our dominant culture seeks to preserve. In emphasizing nuance and multiplicity, an intersectional view of the world refuses to accept a monochromatic view of any person's or group's experience. A monochromatic view, an either-or mindset, it makes it easier to turn one allegedly uniform group, white women in this poem, into a majority, and another, Black women, into a minority that must bend to majority norms and expectations, that must have their particular experience erased. An intersectional view shifts us from this monochromatic either-or to a diversifying both-and. It challenges those so-called majority norms that have let that white one experience rise above others and that have historically contributed to the privileging of one group's struggle. As these youth said, "You may be drinking our tea, but you will never host." Within feminism, an intersectional approach keeps us from claiming that there is a majority view that should be the main host, because it sees the multiple layers of every person's identity and experience. An intersectional approach makes it impossible to say that everyone who shares one particular identity, race, gender identity, disability, socioeconomic status, and so forth, it makes it impossible to say that they are exactly the same and need only one solution. So if we are striving for an intersectional approach, what is it that we as individuals can do? Listen. We listen to the voices and experiences that are excluded because we thought our resources were too scarce, or the marginalizations that we said we could not address because they complicate our efforts. I don't know about you, but it seems complications and complexity are high on the list of UU hobbies. You know that running joke? Ask 3 UUs for an opinion, and you're going to get 8 different answers. Complexity isn't a bad thing, and we as UUs are familiar with it. As the lesbian, Black, womanist author Audre Lorde wrote, there is no such thing as a single-issue struggle because we do not live single-issue lives. If we as Unitarian Universalists truly seek to build a more just and peaceful world for everyone, we cannot shy away from the experiences and efforts that make the work difficult and demand more of us, the voices that tell us single identity solutions are not enough. This intersectionality-based shift away from an either-or mindset, it comes with a new understanding of difference. Within our struggles for social justice and universal liberation, a both-and mindset doesn't see difference as a threat, but rather as a vital element to expanding and embracing our power. When the four voices come together to jointly recite, "Feminism is the four of us reading this poem," they were demonstrating the power that comes from letting movements be expanded and changed by different voices, by different truths, even as they reminded us when they disagree. And our Time for All Ages offered us a couple of those metaphors to expand that possibility of what comes with both and embracing of difference. Images like the patchwork quilt, which could be a symbol of love just as much as it is a blanket and several pieces put together. The rainbow. Both of these items are not made any less beautiful because of their different pieces. In fact, that difference is essential to their impact. It is essential to their existence. And this coming together and serving a greater combined purpose is what we are seeing happen in North Carolina. In late April, when protesters took to the state capitol in an attempt to challenge that transphobic bathroom bill that is legislating who can go to what bathroom, one of the loudest voices in that fight was the Reverend Dr. William Barber, the president of the North Carolina NAACP, a leader of the Moral Mondays movement in that state, which brings together advocates on multiple issues. He and others have powerfully demonstrated what happens when we take a both-and approach to justice and change. Their efforts and impact, they haven't been diluted. Their numbers are on the rise, and their combined presence brings more people to every struggle that has been brought into their fold. Their both-and approach is an embracing of an ethic of solidarity, an ethic of showing up for each other, just like we are doing on May 23rd. When Barber and the NAACP helped organize efforts in North Carolina to protest that transphobic bill, they lived into an understanding that our movements for change are all connected, and that we move forward further and faster when we move forward together. And for us, as Unitarian Universalists, we can appreciate this power-expanding embrace of difference, this intersectional both-and mindset, because it resonates with our values of universalism. This concept of both-and is one that points to multiple possibilities, to infinite evolution. It is a concept that encourages us to consider that abundance of nuance and the experiences in our world. A both-and intersectional mindset is one that lets complexity exist without resorting to competition between difference. They do not detract from each other. They do not detract from each other's value. To engage a both-and understanding of the world is to challenge what the Reverend Dr. Anita Farber Robertson calls a scarcity of the holy. It is a universalist challenge in that it tells the either-or mindset that love, it's not limited, it's unlimited. It's not scarce, but is abundant. Nobody is invited because everybody is already here. An intersectional mindset, a both-and mind and heart, tells us that there is no identity norm that everyone has to adhere to, and no majority should dominate the discourse. There is no single center in our work for justice and change. There's no one starting place for transformation. No identity, no struggle has a monopoly on love. With a both-and mindset, with a both-and heart, we don't invite others into our narrative or experience. We go beyond that practice of inclusion. We come together and we continuously create and recreate with all of our pieces and differences as tools for that table. And we know that the both and mindset and heart, that process of change it inspires, it is a never-ending one. It is one where we are always transformed and always transforming. To borrow from Ibrahim Ferajage once more, there is no such thing as perfection, as arriving to the point where the work is finished. We can only continue to do the work, continually discovering new dimensions of it. So just like my mother, when she decided to start wearing hijab, and I took a little journey too to learn the nuance, just like I am appreciating the change and changing that comes with more gray hair, we can all appreciate the beautiful possibility that comes with complexity. With a both-and mindset, we can embrace the possibilities and transformation that our differences necessarily bring, and the ever-expanding universal love that we are held by and create.